In this video, I'll wrap up Module 11 by talking about leadership. The topic of leadership is of obvious relevance to I/O psychology, where leadership in companies and organizations is an important research topic. However, leadership is a very broad subject that touches on many other areas of research, both within and outside of psychology. For example, leadership may be of interest not only to psychologists, but also to economists, political scientists, and sociologists. Within psychology, there is interest in leadership not just in the subfield of I/O, but also the two subfields we just finished talking about over the past 2 weeks, social and personality psychology. In fact, some of the earliest research on leadership was actually done by social psychologists who were interested in studying group dynamics. And today, many researchers are also interested in the individual differences, or personality traits, that are correlated with more versus less effective leadership, which is something I'll talk more about at the end of the video. First, let's start with defining leadership. No easy task, as even most academics have a hard time agreeing on this one. For our purposes, I'll use Alberto Silva's definition from a 2016 paper. Drawing on previous literature, Silva defines leadership as the process of interactive influence that occurs when, in a given context, some people accept someone as their leader to achieve common goals. Importantly, this definition implies a few things. First, it implies that leadership is a dynamic, ongoing process, not just a personality quality. Second, it implies the existence of at least some people who acknowledge someone as their leader, either voluntarily or by coercion and force. To be a leader, by definition, you need followers. Third, this definition implies that leadership has a purpose, namely to accomplish a goal that is shared with one's followers. If followers perceive that the leader is not acting on their behalf, this can affect the leadership process. Finally, this definition implies that leadership doesn't happen in a vacuum. Rather, it occurs in a context, that is, in a specific time and place. And the characteristics of that surrounding context can affect how the leadership process unfolds. For example, some leadership contexts are relatively short-term, such as if you were president of an on-campus organization for a single semester or two. At other times, the leadership process may be relatively more permanent or long-lasting, such as a king who inherits the throne, presumably for the rest of his life. Leadership can also occur in contexts that are more or less formal. In some contexts, like the military, the leadership process is highly structured and regimented. Commanders are given specific titles that explicitly denote their exact level of authority. Similarly, in most companies today, people might be given a formal job title, such as a manager or CEO, that make their leadership status clear. By contrast, other leadership contexts are more informal and less structured. For example, when you've completed group projects in school, my guess is you've probably had someone who naturally emerged as a group leader, even if this was not something that was formally voted on or discussed by the group. When defining leadership, we also need to distinguish between the ability to become a leader, called emergent leadership, and the ability to be an effective leader once one is actually in a leadership position. Effective leaders have the ability to successfully influence and support a team or group of people, and as we'll see, the qualities that predict emergent leaders are not always the same ones that correlate with effective leadership. The American version of the TV show The Office famously portrayed the character Michael Scott as a well-intentioned but often inept regional manager of the fictional paper company Dunder Mifflin. At some point in our lives, we've all probably known a leader who was a little bit like Michael, and maybe we even see some of his qualities, both good and bad, in ourselves. So what's the impact of having a more or less effective leader? Does it really matter? Well, certainly no one enjoys working for poor leaders, but do effective leaders actually make a difference and improve the overall outcomes of their organization? While the tangible effects of effective leadership can be difficult to quantify, most evidence suggests that it does. For example, one famous study from 2006 looked at data from over 700 medium-sized manufacturing firms in Europe and the US. The study used both surveys and in-depth interviews to measure manager effectiveness. They found that good management practices were strongly correlated with superior firm performance, including increased productivity, profitability, sales growth, and survival. Another study found that high-performing executives can add up to $25 million in value to an organization compared to executives with average performance. So what qualities make for an effective leader? There is certainly no shortage of self-help books, all claiming to offer the latest, best advice on how to lead well. But what does research have to say about the matter? It turns out this has been a particularly difficult question to answer empirically, so much so that there's not yet really a good firm consensus on it. Part of the difficulty relates to the fact that what makes for an effective leader in one type of situation might not translate to other situations, an idea I'll return to in a minute. However, in a review paper, Hogan and Kaiser outlined 4 qualities that they believe are essential to effective leadership in any situation. First, and most importantly, they argue that good leaders must have integrity. This is vital for building trust with subordinates, which is positively correlated with both job performance and job satisfaction. To earn this trust, leaders need to demonstrate that they will not abuse their privileges, but that they will instead fulfill their promises and treat others fairly. Next, good leaders need to make decisions in a timely manner. In times of crisis and uncertainty, the most effective leaders make prompt decisions. Good leaders also need to be competent and possess expertise in relevant domains. It would be really unhelpful to have someone who knows nothing about computers try to run a cybersecurity team. Lastly, good leaders need to project a vision. They need to be able to clearly explain the purpose, meaning, and significance of the organization's undertakings in a way that motivates people to get behind those same goals. Other research has tried to distinguish between different so-called leadership styles, with some styles hypothesized to be more effective than others. Specifically, researchers James Burns and later Bernard Bass have proposed the idea of something they call transformational leadership, which they contrast with transactional leadership. First, transactional leadership, as the name implies, is about a transaction or a give and take. Just like in a monetary transaction you might exchange money for goods, so too in a transactional leadership style, the leader exchanges rewards, like bonuses or promotions, in exchange for good performance from his or her employees. In contrast, Burns and Bass conceptualize transformational leadership as a leadership style that inspires followers to perform beyond their perceived capabilities and achieve remarkable results. Transformational leaders generate enthusiasm for a vision, create opportunities for employees' development, and set high expectations for performance, gaining the respect, admiration, and trust of their employees. Again, as the name implies, this transformational approach is believed to create significant change in the life of people and organizations. According to Burns, transformational leadership is characterized by 3 key components. First, transformational leaders show individualized consideration. That is, they show careful attention to each follower's unique needs, abilities, and aspirations. Next, transformational leaders provide intellectual stimulation that challenges their followers' basic thinking, assumptions, and practices. Finally, transformational leaders are charismatic and inspiring, easily motivating others to follow their vision. On the whole, a transformational leadership style is characterized as being mostly positive, with transformational leaders hypothesized to be more effective than transactional ones. And there's no doubt that these kinds of charismatic transformational leaders can certainly inspire their followers to achieve lofty, virtuous goals. For example, Martin Luther King Jr. was a charismatic leader who inspired the civil rights movement in America in the 1950s and 60s. And tech leader Steve Jobs changed our lives forever when he inspired a team of people to develop a radically new device called the iPhone. But charisma itself is not inherently positive. It can also have a dark side. Just as charisma can rouse followers to realize lofty achievements, so too it can also lead to more destructive outcomes. For example, Adolf Hitler was widely regarded as an inspiring speaker and charismatic leader, but he used that charisma to instigate heinous acts of genocide. Thus, researchers have developed the term pseudo-transformational leadership to distinguish between the more positive transformational leaders who use their charisma to benefit others versus pseudo-transformational leaders who use their charisma for more selfish or evil ends. More recently, other scholars have proposed the term authentic leadership to capture a leadership style that is centered around trust and transparency. According to researchers Avolio and Gardner, authentic leaders are anchored by their own deep sense of self. They know where they stand on important issues, values, and beliefs. With that base, they stay their course and convey to others, oftentimes through actions, not just words, what they represent in terms of principles, values, and ethics. Like transformational leadership, authentic leadership is posited to be beneficial for both followers and organizations. However, this basic concept of authentic leadership has also been criticized on several grounds. It's difficult to define and even more difficult to measure, and some researchers believe that the empirical evidence supporting its effectiveness is relatively weak. So we've discussed what might make for an effective leader. However, an age-old question is whether good leaders are born or made. Another way to put this is in the context of our old friend, the person-situation debate. That is good leadership a personality trait that some people simply have and others do not? Or is leadership more a result of the situation? Can anyone become a good leader in the right context? On the one hand, some personality traits do appear to be correlated with effective leadership. For example, here are the results from a famous meta-analysis by Judge and colleagues in 2002, which looked at how the different Big Five traits correlate with both emergent and effective leadership. As you can see, the biggest predictors of both emergent and effective leadership were neuroticism, extroversion, and conscientiousness. However, it's also important to note that there were some small differences when it came to what made for emergent leaders versus effective ones. It should be no surprise that extroversion was the stronger predictor of who becomes a leader. This makes sense because extroverts tend to be talkative, assertive, and socially dominant. However, it wasn't as important in predicting in who was a successful leader. Introverts might be less likely than extroverts to be chosen for leadership roles, but they can be equally effective once they are actually in a leadership position. This same basic pattern was found for conscientiousness. More conscientious people were also more likely to become leaders, and again, this makes sense. However, conscientiousness wasn't nearly as important in predicting who was actually a successful leader once they were in that role. Overall, however, the correlations between personality traits and leadership effectiveness are not very strong. Personality matters, but other things matter too. For example, one could imagine that scoring high on openness would be very beneficial for the CEO of a new tech startup, where out-of-the-box thinking is essential for the company's success. But that same personality trait may actually be a hindrance for the manager of an accounting firm, where orderliness, structure, and consistency are far more important. Consistent with this reasoning, one older study from the 1950s had high school students complete 3 different group tasks that each utilized a very different skill set. They found that people rarely took the lead for all 3 tasks, suggesting that on some level, participants must have realized that they could be effective leaders in certain situations and for some tasks, but not others. As we've been discussing over the past 2 modules, both the person and the situation matter for predicting different behavioral outcomes, and leadership effectiveness is no different. In short, there does not appear to be a single personality type that makes someone be a good leader. Rather, it's the match between the person and the situation that is key. In this video, I discussed the topic of leadership. For the exam, you should be able to define leadership, as it was discussed in this video, define and distinguish between emergent and effective leadership, discuss what might make for a more versus less effective leader, define and distinguish between the different leadership styles that we talked about in this video, that is, transactional, transformational, pseudo-transformational, and authentic, and identify each one in an example, and discuss how both persons and situations matter for predicting leadership effectiveness.